So at this stage of development, we have our film list page and we have an add film form here that's going to allow us to add a film to the database on the back end. And we also have a film detail page that is very basic at the moment. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to add to this Svelte application some back-end integration with Django and Django REST Framework. So rather than hard coding these films that we see on the page in a Svelte store, what we're going to do is fetch them from an API that we define with REST Framework. And as well as fetching that, later on we're going to see how to add, update and delete the films that we have in the database as well. So what I'm going to do to get started is open up VS Code here, and we have two folders here for the code in video 1 and video 2. Now if you want to follow along, you can go to GitHub and clone this repository. There's a link in the description, and we can start by copying the code that we had at the end of video 2. So what I'm going to do is copy this particular folder. I'm going to paste that in here, and I'm going to rename that as video 3, and it's this video 3 code that we're going to work with in this tutorial. I'm going to open that directory in VS Code now, and we're now ready to get started. What I'm going to do is create a dedicated folder for the front end code, and I'm going to move all of these directories into that folder. So we're going to create a front end folder, and there's going to be also a back end folder for our Django application. So let's move everything into the front end folder. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create another folder here which we'll call backend. So let's create that just now. And now we're going to create a Django project in this backend. So what I'm going to do is bring up a terminal here, and let me make this terminal a bit bigger so we can see it. We're going to cd into the backend directory, and then what we're going to do is create a Python virtual environment. So we'll use the venv module for that, and I'll call the environment venv backend. What we also need to do is add the virtual environment code to our gitignore file. We have a gitignore file in the front end directory. I'm going to move that to the root of this video 3 directory, and we can then add the name of this venv folder, venv backend, to the gitignore file. So let's do that right at the bottom. We'll add the venv backend to that. And what we're now going to do is activate the virtual environment with the activate script, and that will allow us to install Django, Django REST Framework and Pillow into the environment. So we're going to use a pip install command here, and it's Django, Django REST Framework and Pillow. And the reason that we need Pillow is because, as you can see on the front end of this project, we have these placeholders for images, and in order to work with images on a Django backend, we need Pillow to be installed. So let's install those libraries just now. And once these are installed, we can create a Django project using the start project command, and we're going to call the project films backend. After running that command, we can cd into that directory, and I'm going to create an application in that directory, and we can use the start app command, and we're going to call this app films. So just to summarize what's going on here, we have a backend directory that contains a virtual environment, but we also have this Django project here that contains an application called films. We're going to build our models and our views for the API in this films application. What we also need to do is create a requirements.txt file. We can do that by calling the pip freeze command and then outputting that into a requirements.txt file, and that can generate this output that you see here with all of the packages that we're going to use in the requirements file, and we can then push that to GitHub for other developers. That's all of the setup out of the way. Let's get started in this Django application. We're going to build an API for the Svelte application now. So let's close the gitignore file and also requirements.txt. What I'm going to do is go to settings.py, and we just created this films app. So I'm going to go down to installed apps, and what we're going to do is add that to installed apps. And we also need to add Django REST Framework because that's the API library that we're going to use. We need to add that to installed apps as well. Once that's done, we're going to go to models.py, and we're going to define a model here called film, and that will inherit from Django's models.model class. Now what fields do we need on the film model? If we open up the front end application and we go to the source directory's filmstore.js file, you can see the kind of schema that we have here for a film. We have an ID, we have a name, and we have a director. So we're going to add those fields to the model for the film, but we're also going to add a couple of extra fields, or rather one extra field. So let's start with the name field. That's going to be a char field in Django. We'll give it a max length of 128 characters. We're also going to add a description field here. So that is going to be a models.txt field. And we'll add the director of the film as well, and that's going to be another car field here, and we'll give that a max length of 64. The final field we're going to add is an image field, and that's just going to contain some sort of image that represents the film. That's going to be a models.image field, and the image field takes an argument called upload_to, and that is a location within the Django media directory where the file that's uploaded is going to be stored. So what I'm going to add here is a directory called images within the media directory that we'll set up in a second. And that means that all of the film images are going to be stored in that directory. And the final thing I want to do is add a _string method here, and that's going to return just the name of the film. Now let's save that, and what we're going to do on the terminal is run the make migrations command to generate this migration file, and then we can run migrate to generate our initial SQLite database. And you can see that's applied all of the migrations, and it's created within the backend directory this database.sqlite file. Once we've done that, what I'm going to do is go to the admin.py file, and we're going to import the model and register it in the Django admin. So let's import the model at the top here. From the films.models module, we import the film model, and I'm just going to call admin.site.register, and we'll pass the film model to that. And this is going to register the film with the Django admin, and it's going to allow us to go to the admin and add some films to the database that we can use for testing on the API. So let's now create a super user that's going to allow us to access Django's admin UI, and that's with the python manage.py create super user command. We'll call the super user admin, and I'm going to give them a generic password here. And then what we can do is we can actually go to the admin by running Django's development server, and then we can go to the admin and log in with this user that we just created, and you can see the films model appearing in this list here. If we click through to that, what I'm going to do is add some films to the database now. Now actually, before we add the films, what we need to do is we need to set the media directory so that the images that are uploaded are placed within the right directory. Now what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and within the films backend, I'm going to create a new folder here called media. And this is going to be the folder that we use to store all uploaded assets. And then we can go back to settings.py, and I'm going to scroll to the bottom here. And we're going to define a media root here, and that's going to be equal to that media directory that we just created. So it's in the base directory of the Django app, and it's a subdirectory called media. And we can also add a media URL here, and that's going to be /media. Now if you're wondering how this works, you can check out a previous video that I did on the media directory and the media root, and that should be appearing on the screen now. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to the Django admin now, and I'm actually going to add these movies. So I'm going to start by adding The Godfather, and we're going to get back to the video after I've added a couple of films. And I've added two films here. We've got The Big Lebowski and The Godfather. If we go back to VS Code, we're going to look at this media directory that we created, and you can see I've uploaded two images that are associated with those films. We have two PNG files, and you can see that they're stored within an images directory in the media root, and that matches this upload to argument of images that we set in the image field. So now that we have two films in our database, we need to create an API endpoint for returning a list of those films to our client, which is the Svelte application. Now we're going to use Django REST Framework to create the API endpoints. What we need to do to start with is add what's called a serializer to our project. And the serializer allows complex data such as Django query sets and model instances to be converted to native Python data types that can then be converted to JSON and XML and other content types. Now what we're going to do in our project is we're going to create a serializer for a film instance, and to do that in the films application in this Django project, I'm going to create a file called serializers.py, and we're going to use a Django REST Framework model serializer in order to convert the model or a query set of the models to JSON data that can then be sent to the Svelte application and consumed by that application. So we can go to the documentation on the left here for the model serializer class, and I'll leave a link to this page in the description of the video. And you'll want to use a model serializer if the data that you want to convert to JSON maps closely to a Django model definition. And this works very similarly to the model form class in native Django. You define within the class an inner class called meta that ties the model serializer to one of the Django models in your application, and you can also specify which fields you want to convert to and from JSON. So let's go back to VS Code and we're going to create our film serializer just now. So from REST Framework, let's import the serializers module, and we're going to create a class here called film serializer, and that's going to inherit from the serializers.model serializer class, and then we can define the meta inner class within that. And this serializer is going to be tied to the film model. So at the top, I'm going to bring in the film model, and we can specify what fields we want to be in the serialized output. So what we're going to do is serialize the film's ID, its name. We're also going to get the director, and we're going to get the description as well. And finally, we will get the image field. So basically, every single field we have on our film model class here, we're going to serialize that to JSON using this serializer class. So we can save the serializers.py file. We're now going to open views.py, and we're going to define a Django REST Framework API view in order to return the JSON data for movies. Now I'm going to go back to the REST Framework documentation, and again this will be linked below the video. Django REST Framework comes with a bunch of generic views. And as it says here, these generic views in Django, they're developed as a shortcut for common usage patterns. And one of the benefits of class-based views is that they allow you to compose bits of reusable behavior. Now there is a bit of debate in the Django community about whether function or class-based views are better. But for this video, we're going to use Django REST Framework, and that provides a set of class-based views that are very useful and very easy to extend. So we're just going to do that in this video. And you can see one of the classes that we have here, it's a ListAPIView. So this one here, it's called ListAPIView. We're going to click that, and that provides read-only endpoints that represent a collection of model instances. Now what we want to do is create an API endpoint that's going to allow us to return a list of films that can be placed on this page here in the Svelte application. And we're going to subclass this generic ListAPIView from Django REST Framework in order to do that. Now in order to see how these are used, there's an examples section here. We can click that, and you can see we define a class that inherits from one of these generic API views. And to that class you can define certain fields such as the query set, which is going to be represented in that list view. And we have the serializer class that will be used to actually serialize the objects in that query set. And you can optionally define things like permission classes and different filtering and searching backend classes as well. We're going to focus on the basics in this video for now. So what we're going to do is go back to views.py, and at the top from REST Framework I'm going to import the generics module. And this generics module is the one that defines all of those class-based views in REST Framework. And there are different views for different CRUD operations. Once we've imported that, we can bring in another couple of imports. We're importing the film model and also the serializer that we created. Once we've got that, we can create our view, and we're going to call this film list API view. That's going to inherit from the generics.listAPIView. And for a list, we need to define the query set of objects that are going to be returned in that list view. What we're going to do in that case is we're going to return all of the films in the database by specifying film.objects.all. And we also need, of course, a way to serialize that film query set to JSON data, and that's where we specify the serializer class. We're going to set that to the film serializer that we just defined. So that's our film list API view. Let's copy the name of that class, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a urls.py file, and we're going to define a URL pattern that's going to call this view. So let's create a urls.py file within the films application. And at the top here, from django.urls, we'll import the path function. And from the films.views file, we're also going to import that view that we just defined, and that's the film list API view. We can then define the URL patterns for this application. So we'll do that now by setting that equal to a list, and we'll call the path function and define a path for our films on the back end. This is what's going to return that JSON data representing all of the films in the database. And that will be the URL films, and we're going to map that to the film list API view, and we need to call as view because that's a class-based view. And we can then save the urls.py file, and we're going to go back to the project URL configuration, which is in the films backend, and this is the same directory that has our settings.py file. That also has this urls.py file. What we can do here is we can import from django.urls the include function. And we can use that include function within the URL patterns here, and we're going to prefix all of the API URLs with a root of API here, and then we can include the patterns from our application. So the application is called films, and we're going to reference the urls.py module in that application. So as an example, we have the prefix of API here, and if we go back to the films URL patterns, that has a prefix of films. That means that the URL to get these films is going to be /API/films, and we're going to call that API from our Svelte application. Now to test that this is working, we can go back to the browser here, and instead of the admin, I'm going to load the API/films URL that we just defined, and you can see we're getting back the JSON data that represents those 2 films that we added to the database. So this is database data that's now coming back in JSON form, and that's exactly what we need to send to our Svelte application, which can then take that data and handle rendering it in the user interface. So the film list view is working. What we're now going to do is we're going to create an API endpoint that's going to allow us to fetch an individual film by its ID. So for example, the Godfather here has an ID of 2. If we went to the URL /films/2, we want that to return that individual film instance when we call that URL. So how do we create that particular URL in Django REST Framework? What kind of generic class do we need to create here? Now we can do this with another generic class. It's called the RetrieveAPIView, and this is similar to the ListAPIView with the exception of it representing a single model instance. So not a collection of models, this will represent a single model instance, and we can get that model instance by defining, for example, a primary key in the URL. So we're going to use this RetrieveAPIView now in our application. Let's go back to views.py, and we're going to create another view here, and we'll call this film detail API view. And this time we're inheriting from the generics.RetrieveAPIView, and again we just specify the same fields that we used in the list view here. The query set that we're going to look at is film.objects.all. We're going to fetch a particular film from that query set, and we're also going to serialize that instance using the film serializer class. Now once we've added the film detail API view, we can copy the name of that class, and we're going to go back to the urls.py file, and I'm going to create a new URL here. Instead of the film list, we're going to use the film detail API view, and we're going to change the path that's being used here, and don't forget a comma here between these 2 URLs. So the path is going to be /films, and then we're going to define a dynamic URL parameter, and that's going to be for the primary key of the film that we want to fetch from the database. So let's make sure we've imported that view, and we can save this file, and that should be all we need to do to get this working. If we go back to this API endpoint that we had here, this is for the film with the ID of 2. We didn't have that before, but if we refresh this page, you can see we now get that single instance of a film, and that's the film with the ID of 2, which in this case is the Godfather. Let's now move on to the Svelte integration. We're going to open up our Svelte application, so let's close the backend directory for now, and we're going to focus on the front end code. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the film list component. So we have this directory here called films, and that has a page.svelte file, and that is what fetches the list of films currently from the Svelte Store. We want to change that and now get that data from our Django API. Now we want to fetch the list of films from Django as soon as the Svelte component loads, and we can make use of one of the Svelte component lifecycle hooks in order to do that. We have a page here which I'll link below the video. Every component has a lifecycle that starts when it's created and it ends when it's destroyed. And the one that you'll use most frequently is called onMount, and that's run after the component is first rendered into the DOM. And we're going to use that now because when the component is first rendered, we want to then call our API and get the data from Django. So let's go back to the film list component. At the top, we're importing the film store. I also want to import this onMount lifecycle hook, and that's going to be from Svelte. And I'm going to remove this handle click function. We don't need that in this tutorial. And we're going to follow the guide that we have in the documentation here. So if we scroll down, when we import onMount, what you can do is define that function and pass a callback to that function, and that's the callback that's going to run when this component is mounting. And as you can see here, it's calling the fetch API. It's fetching the data from a particular URL and then converting that data to JSON and storing it in a variable called photos. We're going to do something quite similar now, so let's go back to our film list component, and we're going to define this onMount function, and we can pass a callback, which is going to be an async function to that. Now what I'm going to do is just hard code the endpoint that we're going to call to get the list of films from our Django API. And what we can then do is create a variable called response, and we're going to call the fetch function now, and we're going to fetch that data from the endpoint that we just defined above. And we're going to await that promise resolving when the data or when the response comes in from that endpoint. And once we have that response, what we can do is create another variable that we'll call data. And again, we're going to await a promise resolving here, and the promise is going to take the response and convert that response to JSON data. More accurately, this is actually going to take the JSON data in binary form from the response, and it's going to convert that to JavaScript objects that we can then use in a Svelte application. And just to test this out, we're going to console log the data that we're getting back here. And we're now going to test this out to see if we get back the data from the back end. So let's open the browser, and we have the application open here, and I have the developer tools open on the right hand side. Let's refresh the page, and you can see we're getting some errors on the right hand side. You can see at the top here the access to that particular endpoint has been blocked by the cross-origin resource sharing policy. So what we need to do is tell Django that we want to allow these cross-origin requests, and we want to allow our Svelte application to call the backend and get this data and bring it into its own application. Now there's a package I want to use to do that. It's called django-cors-headers. So we're going to add that to the project. And what this does is it allows in-browser requests to your Django application from another origin. And what we have here is we have two different origins. We have localhost 5173, that's the Svelte application. And on the back end we have localhost 8000. That's the Django application, but it's a different origin, and that's because the port number is different. Even though they're both running on localhost, they're regarded as different origins because of the different port number. So in order to resolve this, we can go to django-cors-headers and we can scroll down. I'm going to copy the pip install command, and we're going to stop the Django development server and run that command in the terminal. Once that's installed, we can go back to the documentation, and we're going to follow the steps in this documentation. So we need to add cors headers to our installed apps. Let's go back to settings.py in Django, and we're going to scroll up to installed apps here, and we can add that just at the bottom below REST Framework. Once we've added that, again back to the documentation, we're going to copy this line of code. This is the cors middleware class, and as it says here, this should be placed as high as possible in the middleware setting in Django. So let's go back to settings.py again. We have the middleware setting here. We're going to place it above the common middleware, just like they do in this documentation. So we have the common middleware here, just above that. Let's paste that line of code, and that's for the cors middleware. Once we've got that, we can go back to the documentation, and we need one more setting here. You must set at least one of these settings. So we have cors allowed origins, we have cors allowed origin regexes, and finally we have cors allow all origins. And this last setting to allow all origins, that's going to allow any requests from any origin to be accepted in the Django application. If we scroll down to the setting for this, as it says here, setting that particular setting to true could be dangerous because it allows any website to make the cross-origin request. Now generally you'll want to restrict the list of allowed origins by using one of the other two settings. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this one here. It's called cors allowed origins. So let's copy that and go back to settings.py. I'm just going to place this right at the bottom of our settings file. Let's paste that in there. And cors allowed origins, that's a list in Python, so we can pass any origin we want here. So I'm going to pass localhost 127.0.0.1, and we're going to specify the port from the Svelte application, that's 5173. And as well as that, we can also add the localhost URL directly here. So let's save this and we can run Django's server again. Once that's running, we can go back to our Svelte application, and I'm going to refresh this page. And this time, instead of the error, you can see we're actually getting back the data here. These are JavaScript objects that contain the fields that we specified in our serializer on the back end. So we have a field here for the description, the director, and so on. So the cross-origin issue is sorted out now. We can fetch data from our Django backend and accept that in our Svelte application. And this is pretty secure because no other origin other than localhost 5173 can actually send requests to our Django server. So now that we're getting the data, let's now go back to the Svelte list component. We can remove the console.log line. And what we want to do is take this data and we want to store it in our film store. So our film store at the moment has some hard-coded data. I'm actually going to remove that just now. And we're going to set the initial state, the initial data, to an empty array in JavaScript. So let's save that and go back to the list component. In order to set the data in a store in Svelte, what we can do is we can call the filmstore.set function. And what this does is it sets the value of the data in that store and it informs any subscribers to the store so that they can update their state and update what's shown on the page. What we're going to do is set that data to what we got back from the API, and that was the variable called data here that we got when we called response.json. Now let's save this and go back to the Svelte application. If we refresh this page, you can see we're still getting the films that we had before, but this time they're coming from the Django API. We no longer have them hard-coded in the Svelte store. This time we're getting them from the API and we're setting the store value accordingly. Now one issue that we have here is that the images are not showing on the page. We're going to fix that now by going back to the film list component here, and I'm going to scroll down to where we defined the image HTML element. At the moment the source attribute for this element is set to an empty string. Now as you can see up here in this loop, we are iterating over each film in the store, and each time we iterate we have access to that film, and that's a variable here called film. What we're going to do is reference the film's image by using this syntax here. So each film has an image. We're going to grab that image and we're hopefully going to show that on the page. So let's save this and go back to the page. If we refresh this page, we're still not seeing any images, and you can see that the reason for that is that we're getting a 404 not found. Now what I'm going to do is go to some documentation in Django here, and that is about serving files that are uploaded by users during development. So during development you can serve these files from the media root by using one of the views that are provided by Django. And we're basically going to copy these lines of code here, and as it says we're going to paste them into the root URL configuration. So let's go back to VS Code, and we're here in the root URL configuration. That's the urls.py file that's in the same directory as the settings. So let's paste in those imports, and we can then go back to the documentation and we can copy this line of code here, and we'll paste that after the URL patterns list, and we're basically appending to that list the static view here and passing the media URL and the media root in there, and that is going to allow us to serve these media files. So let's save urls.py, and we're going to go back to the Svelte application and refresh this page, and this time you can see we're getting these images that I uploaded and they are displayed on the front end. So this is how we can take some images that are stored on a Django model using an image field and saved to a media directory. We can take them and serve them through an API and have them displayed on the front end in this Svelte application. And if we go back to serializers.py, the reason that we're actually sending that URL in the first place for the image is because we've added that field to the serializer for the film model class. Now one thing you might want to note here is that every time we navigate away from the film list page, we for example could go to the film detail page. When we go back to the film list page, we're going to call the API again, and that is because we are calling it by default every time the component is mounted. In other words, every time the film list component is displayed on the page. In order to prevent calling the API every time this component is loaded, we can add an if statement here, and we can check if the film store has any values by looking at its length. And if it doesn't, what we can do is we can only then call the API endpoints here. So we're only fetching the data from this endpoint if there is not already data in the film store. So we've covered the list view for the films. Let's now go to the detail view, which is in this directory here, and it's the page.svelte file within that directory. This is the detail page that we have when we click the view button here, for example, to go to here. Now we want to fetch a film by its ID, and the ID is available here in the URL. We need to call the backend and get that film. However, if the film store is populated from the film list page, we can just look it up in that store. So let's write the code to do these tasks now. At the top, I'm going to import that 𝗰𝗵𝗽𝗁𝗲𝗲. And then underneath the data variable, I'm going to create another variable called film. And initially that's going to be set to null. Now we have this filmStore.find function. We can keep that under certain circumstances if the film store has any data in it. So what we're going to do is we're going to define our onMount function here, and again we'll pass an async function to that. First of all, we're going to check again, does the film store have any data, by looking at its length, and if it does, what we can do is we can copy this statement that is searching the film store and trying to find the film in that store. We can copy that into the if statement here. So if there are any films in the store, we can then call the find function and try and find the film by the ID that's in the URL. Now what happens if the film store is not populated when we land on this page? We can define an else block for that case. And again, I'm going to hard code an endpoint here. It's localhost 8000/API/films. And this time we're adding the ID of the film that we want to fetch to the end of that URL. And this is what's going to call Django's detail API view that's going to fetch a single film by the ID that's provided in that URL. So that's the endpoint. What we can then do is create a variable called response, and we're going to call that endpoint using the fetch function. And then once we have that, we can check if the response status is equal to 200. So if we get back a film when we call that endpoint, what we can do is we can set that film by awaiting the call to response.json. So again, we're converting the response object to JavaScript objects that we can then store in the film variable. If the response status is not 200, we can add another else block here and just set the film equal to null. So let's quickly go over this logic again. We are importing the onMount lifecycle hook, and we're defining a function that runs when the film detail page is loaded. When it's loaded, we're going to check the film store to see if it has any films, and we're going to try and find the film by the ID that's in the URL. If the film store does not have any objects, we're going to defer to calling the API here. We define the endpoint and we call that API. Once we get back a response, if that response is of status 200, we're converting that response to a JavaScript object and storing it in the film. And if we scroll down here to the HTML here, if we have a valid film here, we're rendering its name and the director. Otherwise, we are rendering that no data was found with the given ID. Now let's go back to the component here and refresh this page. And you can see that initially when we refresh, you can see that no film was found, but it very quickly changes to this film here when that data comes back from the API. If we go back to the film list, that's going to populate the Svelte film store. When we then click through to a detail page, you can see that that is just being fetched immediately from the store. Whereas on the refresh, we have to call the API because when we refresh the Svelte application, the data in the store is lost in that case. But either way, we are able to fetch the data by checking the film store, and then if there's nothing in that, we can defer to calling the detail endpoint in the Django application. Now what I'm going to do very quickly is style up this detail page, and I'm going to remove the console log here. I'm just going to paste some code in here and we're going to move on with the video. If you want to get this code directly, check the GitHub link for video 3, and it's the detail components page.svelte file. So we're also rendering the image out here, and as well as the image, also the description, as well as the name and director. Let's save that and go back to our page, and we get this very basic looking detail page. We have the name of the film in a header here. We have the image on the left hand side. We have some details on the right. We have the name of the film and also the director, as well as the description that is coming from the back end. Now at this stage, we want to give users the ability to add a new film to the database and also to the list page. If we go back to the Svelte application, it's under the films/add directory. We can go to the page.svelte file in that particular directory. Now at the moment, as you can see, we have two fields in this form. That's for the name and the director, but we also have two new fields on the back end for the film description and also an image that is associated with the film. So let's go back to the component. We have the variables here, name and director. These are bound to fields in the form here using the bind attribute. What we're going to do is define two new variables here, one for the description of the film and also one for the files that are going to be uploaded and saved to the database. Once we've added the two new fields, we can go down to the HTML for this component, and we have the two fields here. I'm going to add two more fields for those new variables. We have another text field here, and that is bound to the description in the Svelte component. And at the bottom, we have a different type of input element here. We have a type of file, and that's bound to that variable files that we have in the component up here. So let's go to the page for adding a film, and you can see we now have the two new fields for description and for the file. Now what we need to do now is we need to be able to send a post request to Django to submit this data and have it stored in the database when the user fills out this form. So what I'm going to do is go back to the component, and within the handle submit function, what we were doing before, we were adding the film to the store. We're going to remove that for now, but I will keep the navigation function here called goto. We're going to keep that around, but what we need to do is define another endpoint, and again it's going to be /API/films. That's the same endpoint as the list page, but this time we're going to add the capability for that endpoint to take a post request and add the data in that post request to the database. So that's the endpoint. After we've created that, we can create a variable called data. This is going to be a new form data object, and this allows us to send data to the server. So we're going to add different pieces of data to that form data object. We can do that using data.append, and the first argument is the name of the key or the string that we're going to add to form data. So we're going to add the name of the film, and we're going to reference the name variable that's in the Svelte component up here. So when the user types on the front end here the name of a particular film, that's going to be bound to the value in this variable. So when we click submit, we want to send that name to the server. And I'm going to copy this line of code down a couple of times. As well as the name, we want to send the director, and we can use the value of the director variable in the Svelte component, and also the description. We want to send that to the server when we submit this form as well. And there's one more field that we need to send, so let's copy this line of code down. The next field is the image. We want to send the image that's uploaded to the server as well. And we're going to reference the files, which is this variable here on line 8. We're going to reference that, and as you can see in the input fields here, we have this particular input field bound to that variable. So we're going to reference the first value that's uploaded, so the first file that is uploaded, and we can get that by indexing in at 0. So that is going to add all of the data that we need to send to the server, to this form data object. We can then call the fetch function and pass that endpoint in, and we're going to pass some data here. Because this is going to be a post request, we're going to pass a JavaScript object that specifies that this is going to be a post request. And we also need to pass a body in here, and that's going to be equal to the data, the form data object that we created and added variables and data to on the lines above. So this is the fetch request. It's going to send a post request to this endpoint with the data that we specify. After we call fetch, we're going to get back a response. We can call the .then function to get that response back, and we are then going to convert that response to JSON. So we're going to take the response and call the .json function, and that again is going to return a promise that when it resolves, we want to call .then. We're going to finally get the data from the post request, the data that's returned from that post request, which should be the new object that's created in the database. And for now, let's just console.log that data to the terminal. Just to reiterate what's going on here, we're calling that endpoint and sending a post request with the data, and then we get back a response. And when we get that response, we want to convert it to JSON. We call response.json to do that. That returns a promise that we can then take the data from when we call .then. So let's now go to the Django side of things. We need to allow this endpoint to accept a post request. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to views.py, and we're going to change this code up a little bit. We're using two generic views at the moment, but what we're going to do now is use a Django REST Framework view set. And as it says here, REST Framework allows you to combine the logic for a set of related views into a single class called a view set. And a view set is simply a type of class-based view, and a view set can by default handle all of the typical CRUD operations on a model. You can see the example down below. We define a view set that inherits from the Django view set class, and you can provide the logic for different endpoints using functions within that view set. We're going to create a very simple view set in this tutorial. So let's go back to views.py. I'm going to comment out the two list views here, And at the top, what I'm going to do is import from REST Framework the viewSets module. So we're importing viewSets, and we're going to define a new class here that's going to be called filmViewSet. And this is going to inherit from the viewsets.modelViewSet class. And what we can do is we can copy the query set and the serializer class up to this viewSet. We can just paste them in there and we can remove the comment. And this is actually all we need to do in order to create a set of API views that are going to allow us to get objects, create objects, update and delete objects. We'll see more about that in the rest of this video and in the next video. What we're going to do now is go back to views.py and we'll copy the name of this viewSet. And we need to change the way that we're defining these URLs. So I'm going to remove the URL patterns, or rather let me just comment them out for now. And we can remove the import at the top here of these two class-based views. Now instead of those, from films.views, I'm going to import the film viewSet that we just created. And we are then going to define what's called a default router in Django REST Framework. So let me go back to the documentation for REST Framework. And it's this page here on routers. I'll link this below the video as well as the viewSets page. These router classes allow us to define very simply some routes that conform to REST best practices. And what we can do is go to the default router here, and that gives us this set of URLs here. We're going to create an instance of this default router now, and we're going to link it to our viewSet that we just created. So let's go back to urls.py, and from restframework.routers, we're going to import the default router. We can then instantiate that and store it in a variable called router. So we'll instantiate the default router here, and then we can call its register function. And the register function takes a URL prefix here. We'll give it the prefix of films. And as it says in VS Code, we also need to provide a viewSet. We're going to provide the film viewSet here, and we'll give it a base name of films. And the final thing we need to do is set the URL patterns to the router.urls. Now we need to test if this is still working, so let's go back to the Svelte application. We're going to go back to the film list page. You can see we're still getting those films, but this time it's using the viewSet in order to do that, and that is going to work for the detail page as well. We're now going to go back to the adding a film section of this video, and we're going to test adding a film just now, and I'm going to open the console while I do this. Now I've filled this in with some details now. Let's click the submit button, and you can see we get back the JSON data on the right hand side, and that contains the data that was added. So we have the director and the name of the film. However, the film is not appearing on the list page, and that's because we've not added it to the store when we got that successful response. That's the last thing we need to do in order to get this working, I think. So let's go back to the component, and it's this add film component here. After we've fetched the data, all we're doing is we're console logging the data, but we actually need to call the filmstore.update function as we did before. And this time the update function, it takes the previous state that was in the store. We're going to update that state by returning a new array that contains all of the previous values, but also the data that we're getting back from the server. And that data is this parameter here. This is what we get after we call response.json when we send that post request. So we're adding that data to the store, and we're preserving all of the existing values as well. So let's now save this, and if we go back to the Svelte application, I'm going to refresh this page, and you can see now we get Chinatown appearing on the page. I'm going to add some random data here, and we're going to test to see if this is working. This time when I submit that data, you can see that it automatically appears on the film list, and that's being added to the database on the back end. And this time in the success response here, we're also updating the Svelte Film Store, so that that new film is immediately available in the store when we navigate back to the film list page using the goto function. Now I want to very quickly add one last thing in this video. If we go back to the add film form, you might want to add a validation to this form to make sure you're not sending data to the server that is not valid. Now in order to do that, I'm going to add some new data to the Svelte component. Let's go back to VS Code. And we're not going to add any complex validations here, but I'm going to show you a basic example of how this might be done. We're going to add a variable called showInvalidMessage and set that by default to false. And then we're going to add a very simple validation function called validFields. And this function is going to look at the name that the user entered, as well as the director and the description as well. And it's going to check the length of each of those and make sure that they are greater than a specific number. And it's going to do that for all of them using this AND operation here, this logical AND. So if any one of those is not true, this is going to return false. Now within the handle submit function, before we call the endpoint, we can call this valid fields function to check whether or not the form data is valid. So let's do that at the top of handle submit. We're going to check if we don't have valid fields. So we need to call that function in order to get back its response. And if the response is false, that is going to evaluate to true here, and we can then set show invalid message to true. And then we can simply return from this handle submit function before we call the endpoint. So we're not going to try and add that invalid data to the database. Let's save this, and we just need to scroll down now and add a couple of attributes to the HTML. Just at the top here, underneath the header, I'm going to add a Svelte if statement here, and we're going to check if the show invalid message variable is set to true. And if that is set to true, we're going to display the h4 element here. That tells us that the form data is not valid. So what we have in the validation handler here is we're checking if the name is greater than 4 characters, if the director is greater than, let's say, 4 characters as well. And we're also checking if the description is greater than 10 characters. So let's go back to the browser and we're going to test this out now. Let's add some data here, and I've got a name here that's less than 4 characters. So let's test if this works. When I submit this, you can see that we get this rather crude message telling us that the form data is not valid. If we increase the length of the name of the film and also the description, we should now see that we can actually submit that and it's added to our database. So that is a very basic example of how to do some validation on the form. We define a function with some very simple validation logic, and then we are calling that function here within the handle submit function. So that function, the validation function, will be called when we try and submit the form, and if the validation function returns false, we're going to set the invalid message to true, and we're going to prevent the endpoint being called with the submitted data. And then that invalid message will go from false, which is its default value when the component loads. That will then be set to true, and when it's set to true, this if statement will evaluate to true and show this message to the user. Now there are much more complex and much better ways to handle validation than this. It's a very basic example just at the end of this video. If you're interested in form validation in Svelte, we can do some proper videos on that later on. But that's all for this video. What we've covered in this video is how to set up a Django API backend that's going to return JSON data where our database rows are serialized to JSON and returned to the Svelte application. And we've done that in a couple of different ways. We defined some generic views earlier in the tutorial, but at the end we've changed that to a view set. And when we changed that to a view set, we saw how to change the urls.py file to use a REST Framework default router and register that view set's URLs with that router and set the URL patterns to those URLs. And we also learned in this video how to create a very basic model serializer using REST Framework, and also how to add CORS settings using the django-cors-headers package. So this video has been a first attempt at adding Django integration to our Svelte application. In the next video, we're going to look at how to create an update API view and also a delete API view. And we're also going to see how to add tags to our Django film model, and then how to filter those films that we see on the list page on the front end, and that's these films here, how to filter them by the tags that have been added dynamically. And in order to do that, we'll install a couple of libraries such as Django Target and Django Filter. We'll see how to do that in the next video. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying this content, please consider buying a coffee as well. And we'll see you in the next video.